Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank all of the organizers and Maria for including me in this symposium. It is now 2:42 according to my watch, or according to this. I'll go by the one here. And I have 30 minutes. Maybe I won't even need all those minutes, but just to be clear. And when I was asked to come and speak about this research that I've been doing over the past while on the problem of the crucifixion. As if the uninitiated don't have enough problems vis-a-vis the Qur'an, if they probe deeply enough into its text and the general understanding of this text by the vast majority of Muslims, they come to learn with some surprise and shock that Jesus is held to have not been crucified. And this is, of course, mentioned, as everyone knows, in only one verse in the Qur'an, the whole idea of the crucifixion. And it has generated a great deal of exegetical literature, like all verses of the Qur'an. But what I wanted to do was to look at this verse sort of from a global sampling of Islamic sources. So in the book that I have written, I've looked at what we call somewhat retroactively Sunni Tafsir, that is up until a certain point, Tafsir that eventually came to be known as Shi'i Tafsir, Sufi Tafsir, and also the commentaries or the explanatory literature that one finds in the Ismaili literature. Ismaili Muslims, branch of the Shia, of course, have classically not been associated with the genre of tafsir, which is a very interesting fact in itself. And I think it's something to bear in mind while we think about this one issue of the crucifixion of Jesus, which is recounted in, as everyone knows, Surah 4, verse 157, and which gives if one translates the verse literally, it says, as for the Jews who boast that they killed Jesus, son of Mary, the Messiah, they did not kill him and they did not crucify him, right? But it only appeared so to them. And they did not have certain knowledge about this, and they are in error about it. And God raised Jesus to himself. It's particularly interesting to think about this verse in the context of Asma's presentation earlier, which of course relied a great deal on those fi sabilillah verses, which we are cautioned, don't consider those people who, one might say, appear to have died in the path of God as dead, but rather living in the presence of their Lord. What we find in the standard Tabari and following tradition is a desire to look at this verse in the Qur'an as saying that, in fact, it was not Jesus who was crucified. Rather, someone else was put upon the cross because no one really knew who Jesus was. This is why he had to be identified by one of the disciples. And the disciples, in short, played fast and loose with everyone's knowledge of who Jesus was, and someone else was chosen. And therefore, this person was crucified, and therefore the Jews, though they think that they might have crucified Jesus and killed him, in reality, someone else was killed. This has been sort of the controlling scenario within Sunni Tafsir. What I discover in the history of the Tafsir literature from just the Sunni side is that there seems to be a gradual desire to move away from this scenario and to look at the deeper meaning of the verse. and suggests that there might be a sort of poetic meaning along the lines of those verses about say not of those who are killed in the path of God that they are dead. Right? So there are a certain amount there's a certain amount of discussion about this verse in Zamakshari, which indicates that it was perhaps much more mysterious than we think, that another person was crucified. It can be, in fact, that perhaps Jesus was crucified, but it wasn't really the Jews who were in charge. And this, of course, aligns with some statements within the Christian tradition itself ascribed to Jesus. For example, fear not those who can kill the body, but fear those who can kill the body and the spirit. So this set up a kind of a problematic for me to pursue. And I thought, well, now we must look at the Shi'i Tafsir. And of course, the commonly received opinion is that Shi'i Tafsir actually begins with a Tusi and Tabrasi and so on, and goes on and through the Safavid era to the major compilations of that time. And now, of course, we have contemporary Shi'i Mufassirun who are working on the text. I found in the pre-Tusi Shi'i Tafsir a kind of variety of opinion about the notion of crucifixion, which seems to have been, there seems to have been a certain amount of distance placed between the Twelver Shi'i community and this early, somewhat ambiguous or at least poetic understanding of the text. In the Tafsir ascribed to Ja'far as-Sadiq, for example, who is naturally not quoted by at-Tabari, to sort of counter the idea that these authors collected everyone. We all know that there's much left out of Tabari and other Sunni exegetes. A great deal has been attributed to him, and one of the problems is, of course, to try and determine exactly how to verify these texts. The Tafsir that I'm referring to here is a manuscript which was published by Paul Nguyen in a kind of critical edition, and I also compared it with another manuscript that I had access to in those days, but I seem no longer to have access to it. But the commentary is quite brief on 4.157. Interesting in that it is quite different from anything produced by contemporary exegesis at the time, and has a different spirit or jiao than the later Sunni substitution theories. This might have been expected in light of what is known about the nature of his mystical exegesis, as the Tafsir is attributed to Ja'far, who is a contemporary of Muqatil and Ibn Ishaq. The most striking aspect of this Tafsir on this verse is that the author restricts his comments to only a small phrase in the verse, "Verily, we killed the Messiah." No attempt is made to identify the Messiah here, presumably everyone knew who was intended, or indeed anyone else usually and later associated with the verse. There's a great program of dramatis personae in the later exegesis. In fact, Jesus himself is not even mentioned by name and is only referred to by a pronoun, identifying him as one of an anonymous group called here the prophets of God. The main business of the Tafsir is to discuss the implications of the killing. Killing is said to be of three types. Killing from the world or of the world, katla dunya, by abandoning it to its enemies, to the enemies. Killing of the sins of a lover, somewhat poetic, and killing of the passion of a knower, arif. The author then says that he, Jesus, gained a high rank, rif'ah, thereby offering a commentary on the verb that God raised Jesus to himself. but transmutes this, what is in the Sunni tradition is actual raising of some kind, to a raising of rank. He achieved a high rank by being killed, just as God raised his other prophets. Wallahu fi qatlihi rif'a kama rafa'a Allah anbiya'ahu. God seated him, Jesus, on the throne of intimacy, uns, and liqa, reunion. Right? So this raised more questions. We have this, even if it isn't written by Ja'far Sadiq, it's esteemed by a readership, a tradition, as having been part of the understanding of this very problematic verse. And seems to me that, it needs to be discussed in discussions of the problem of the crucifixion of Jesus. So I thought, well, let us see what the Ismailis are saying about this verse. And I looked at 2 or 3 authors. The first one, Abu Hatim Ar-Razi. This scholar was one of the most important spokespersons for the Ismaili intelligentsia. His debates with Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Ar-Razi are part of the history of Islamic thought. As we all know, Ibn Zakaria was the one who argued that revelation has caused more problems than it solved. These prophets and these religions seem to divide people rather than unite them. And one of the in the debate, there's a classical debate between Abu Hatim and Ibn Zakaria. One of the points about which Ibn Zakaria challenges Abu Hatim, who is now defending revelation and religion and prophethood, to this skeptic, this scientist who seems to have no reason or no need of religion, answers the challenge from Ibn Zakaria that one of the proofs of this is that the Qur'an denies the crucifixion. Right? And how can this be true if all of these, if this has been held through tawatur, a universally acclaimed opinion, through all these generations since within the Christian community. I'll just read a little bit of what Ar-Razi says in the Alam al-Nubuwa. An example of this, Abu Hatim says, it really is quite otherwise. Jesus was indeed crucified, and the statement in the Qur'an must be read to support rather than deny the crucifixion. And we have other examples along the lines of the one I mentioned earlier. An example of this in the Evangel is to be found in the Gospel of John, where it says, the Messiah died in the body, in fi jasad, whereas he is alive in the spirit, bil ruh. So they thought that he who died in the body was delivered from sin. Then Abu Hatim says, in the Gospel of Luke, it is said, I say to you, O my dear friends, awliya, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot do more than that. And Abu Hatim, who obviously knew the Bible very well, although we can't find all of these quotations, in the Gospel of Matthew, it is said, do not fear those who kill the body but are not able to kill the soul. And do fear the one who can both destroy the soul and cast the body into the fire of hell. According to the editors of the printed edition of the text, the 2 passages which Ar-Razi thus quotes correspond to John 6:50-63 and Luke 12:4 and Matthew 10:28, although aligning it with, I believe, the Lucan passage is somewhat problematic completely. So, Ar-Razi maintains that these passages from the Gospels are consistent with the Qur'an, and therefore the Qur'an does not pose a problem as being in disharmony with the other religious communities of the time, since both scriptures attest that Jesus was crucified. So there are other statements from other Ismaili authors, for example, Sijistani, who flourished around 971, a member of the Ismaili Da'wah, certainly, sometimes translated as the underground mission, but in any case, he was a representative of the Ismaili program of the time, end of the 10th century. Jesus, peace be upon him, gave his community to know that the master of the resurrection, the Sahib al-Qiyamah, is the one of whom he is the sign. For Jesus, when he unveils the structural reality, Sijistani is a philosopher, the structural realities of the sacred laws, which are composed of the sacred realities, the people will know them and will not deny them, just as when all the people see a crucified one on a cross. They will recognize him and understand this form, although most of them would have been ignorant of him before that. So the idea of the crucifixion of Jesus is seen as a sign for the coming return of the Mahdi or the Imam. Because this is the meaning when the Qa'im refers to the day of bearing, the Yawm al-Kash. Just as he said in the Qur'an, upon the day when the leg shall be bared, the Yawm yukshafu ansaq, and they shall be summoned to bow themselves. Thus the crucified one on the wooden structure became an unveiled one, makshuf, although he was concealed before the crucifixion. In other words, it was through the crucifixion that the da'wah was projected. So this is remarkable. If we now follow the history of Shi'i Tafsir as a whole, including both what we call Twelver Shiism and Ismaili Shiism, we see that the history of it to this time seems to preserve a debate. But this debate is finally settled in the works of At-Tusi and Tabrisi, who adopt the position of Tabari, almost word for word, with some Mu'tazili influences, to say that this verse actually means that Jesus himself was not crucified, and they did not know. The Mu'tazili part is, it makes sense that they didn't know who it was because he was crucified on a hill so far away that nobody could really see, right? So we see here the Shi'i community coming into harmony with what had been established in the Sunni tafsir, and the unspoken elephant in the room, that is to say the Ismaili position, is utterly ignored and silenced. So I think this is significant, because what we have at this time, of course, is the historical fact of the so-called Fatimid threat. It is during the time of At-Tusi that the Fatimids actually conquer Baghdad, and the Fatimid azan is being uttered for a year and a half or so in the middle of the Sunni heartland. So there is a great deal of invested in the project of demonstrating, after this period passes, that you have nothing to do with this threat, and that you are Baghdadi citizens, if you like. So I think that this represents at least one way of understanding how this diversity within the tafsir literature, which we clearly see, and in the interpretation of the Qur'an, which is why I'm drawing a line between tafsir and the meaning of the text, how we can understand it, and how we still have these sources. Ikhwan al-Safa is the most famous example of Muslim literature upholding the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus. It's a rather long passage. I won't read it all. But what happened is that the Sunni tradition, it seems, in defense of its ethos and its identity, and the 12 or Shi'i Mufassirun combined to somehow or another exclude this Ismaili understanding from the tafsir literature. Later, much later, in the Safavid period, in the tafsir of Faiz Kashani, we see a kind of a reemergence of this tendency to think, if you like, poetically about this verse, to say that it's that no one could kill Jesus. Only God could kill Jesus. The Jews are an example. In the passage in the Qur'an where this verse occurs, the Jews have just been castigated for committing a number of sins, right? And the last one mentioned is this, not the crucifixion of Jesus, but the claim to have crucified him. Remember that the Qur'an doesn't say that Jesus was not crucified or that Jesus was not killed. The Arabic is very clear that they didn't kill him and they didn't crucify him. And amongst the catalog of variants for Quranic verses, there doesn't seem to be one available which gives a different ma suliba, for example, or ma kutila. We don't seem to find this anywhere. So it's important, I think, to bear in mind the entire fabric of Islamic discussion of these verses before we go out so enthusiastically or confidently saying the Qur'an denies the crucifixion. And that's mainly what I wanted to share with you this afternoon. But if there is a little time, and I think there is some time, good. What I think this points to are a couple of things, and that is, the Qur'an was addressed to humanity, and in a sense belongs to humanity, however one may feel about this. Tafsir was addressed to the Muslims. And not only was Tafsir addressed to the Muslims, but it was addressed to an intramural discussion that was going on amongst Muslims. And through the act of Tafsir, one's orientation and credentials could be demonstrated and validated or not. It is very important to recognize this, that they, and this is partly what this whole wonderful conference is about, to contemplate seriously these categories of scripture and interpretation. With regard to interpretation, of course, it's a fascinating study, and there's plenty to keep us occupied for a very long time, and much more that we haven't even started looking at yet. And the idea that interpretation exists in works other than classical seriatim tafsir is a very important one. Certainly the poets and the